One of the things we've been talking about in a sort of hypothetical sense since the riots in Washington, D.C. on January 6th is if instead of being a mostly white male conservative crowd there, storming the Capitol, fighting with police, pushing police with barriers, hitting police with fire extinguishers, and on and on and on, if it had been a Black Lives Matter protest, if the political orientation had been different or the racial makeup of the people there had been different, would it have been allowed to go on for as long as it did? Would it have been handled in the same way? And I think intuitively, most of us who understand the way things have gone down in the United States for the last many years can only come to the conclusion that no, it would not have been the same if the protests last week had been different groups of people in terms of their makeup or politically oriented in a different way. We don't just have to intuit our sense of that, because we actually have a study about this, and Barack Obama shared this on his Twitter account recently. And the study was done by ACLED, ACLED. It's a data reporting project, and it looked initially they used to look at armed conflicts in African countries, and then they started looking at the United States. And in the United States, we've had so many protests/riots of different kinds that there's plenty of fodder and data to look at. And what ACLED found is that law enforcement is much more likely to try to shut down left-wing protests than they are right-wing protests. When law enforcement uses force to shut them down, they are much more likely to use force in the left-wing protests than in the right-wing protests by a 51% to 34% margin. More than half the time when they decide to shut down a left-wing protest, they use force. Only about a third of the time when they decide to shut down a right-wing protest, they use force. And there are a number of different things to consider here. You might say, well, maybe the left-wing protests are more violent, and thus it makes sense that police are more likely to try to shut them down or to use force. That is not what the data actually shows. The data does not show that left-wing protests are more violent than right-wing protests. Another consideration would be, where are the left-wing versus the right-wing protests taking place? In other words, political orientation of the protest aside, are the left-wing protests happening in places whose police departments for other reasons are more likely to prevent them from going on too long, whereas the right-wing protests are happening in places whose police departments are more lax in allowing them to go on? That also does not appear to be the case. And so this is a really this is not a trivial thing. And where I believe much of the investigation needs to be is in the political orientation, not just of the police officers, but of the police departments, and this also includes mayors. We know that law enforcement is a relatively conservative group. Law enforcement in total supported Trump in 2020 at a much greater level than the average population. So, of course, there are liberal police departments and police departments with liberal police chiefs or that work under liberal mayors. There's no doubt about that. But overall, the makeup of the officers tends to be far more right-wing than the average population. This also applies to the military, although we did see in 2020 that the military was more supportive of Joe Biden than they've been of most past Democratic candidates, at least going back a number of elections. So certainly we have to consider whether the political orientation of the officers plays a role, and also if you have right-wing officers but a more centrist or center-left police chief and mayor, how does that affect the handling of protesters? What we know is that when we talk about the right to protest, if the left-wing protests aren't more violent, and we know that they are not, but yet police are more like, and the left-wing protesters are not more likely to be armed, and they are not, then we have to say, well, why is it that the left-wing protests are more likely to be shut down? And is that a restriction of speech? And we've seen right-wingers either misunderstand or pretend not to understand when the First Amendment is a factor. Twitter suspending Trump is not a First Amendment issue. It has nothing to do with the First Amendment. We hear all the time, my First Amendment rights, Trump's First Amendment rights, when it has nothing to do with the First Amendment. But when you see a political discrepancy in which protests are shut down along the lines of the political orientation or motivations of the protests by police under the guidance of police chiefs, city councils, mayors, etc., you really actually have to start asking questions about whether the government is suppressing speech and suppressing it along political lines. So none of this is a catch-all that explains every circumstance, but it's a very good data analysis. 538 has a write-up about it. Again, the organization that did the analysis is ACLED, ACLED, and we'll link to the article about it in the description on the YouTube clip for this story. Take a look at it. Let me know what you think. You can find me on Twitter @DPakman.